Hi, my name is John and welcome back to the chaos that is Shani and Books. Today I'm going to be giving you all my bookish stats from 2022. I love stats, so maybe you're not super interested in this, but if you like hearing about people's reading stats, then here we go. So I read 77 books last year. My reading goal on Goodreads was 22 books. I keep getting interrupted. I set my reading goal on Goodreads to 22 books. I have read, I think, over 100 books in previous years, but I don't set it to 100 because some years, like 2020, I barely read any. So I start off at 20 books. So that was my goal, which I did complete, I think, in like March, because I started off the year really good. But in total I read 77, which I'm still very happy with. To me, honestly, it doesn't matter how many books I read as long as I come out with some new books that I love. Lighting is going to keep changing. And here are all of the books that I read, I think, on screen. By the way, these stats are not 100% accurate. I do have an interrupting child, so I tried to like jot everything down in my journal, but if I've missed books, then you know, it is what it is. So my total pages read was 21,990, which brings my average book length to 286, which honestly feels right because I read some short books. Oh, also, by the way, another disclaimer, the saga graphic novels really skewed my reading stats. Some were rereads and then I continued on in the series, but I was reading the individual volumes, so I was counting individual volumes as the individual books. So you'll see in a second, my stats are really skewed because of that, which probably also brought down my average book length because the volumes are only like 150 pages each. But I do read a lot of short books, which, let's look at the graph for book length. So a majority of the books that I read were under 300 pages, which again, saga contributes to this. And then over 400 pages is obviously the least because I don't really read big books. So that brings my average pages per day to 60, which again kind of checks out because I did have an odd reading year. When I was reading, I was reading a lot, and when I wasn't reading, I read nothing. I actually do track how many pages I read each day, so I can actually tell you how many pages I read each day in general. If you didn't see my journaling video from the start of 2020, I have this page in my journal. Hold on. I have this page in my journal, which is my year in reading pixels. So down here, I have a key. So if I read 0 pages, I color it blue. If I read between 1 and 50 pages, I color the square green, and there's obviously a square for every single day of the year. And as you can tell by the full thing, I had a lot of blue days, which is 0 pages. So there are entire sections of the year where I wasn't reading at all, which is why my average pages per day is 60. When I was reading more than 60 pages. So I don't know if that makes sense. So I can actually tell you the most common number of pages I read each day in this graph. Taking out the 0, because obviously I had entire months where I wasn't reading, the most common amount of pages that I read per day is actually over 200, which interesting. So when I was reading more than 200 pages a day. And interesting, the least common color that I had to color in was between 151 to 200 pages. So it seems once I got past that 100 page mark, I just keep pushing on until the past 200 mark. And then after that, between 1 and 50 is the next least common. So it was actually interesting, and I'm really glad that I had this tracker because it's really interesting to look back on. I'm hoping that this year I don't have a lot of the 0 page colored in, but it's fine. I had a tough year. So which brings me to books per month, which is actually this graph, but I'll pop it up on screen. So as you can see, a couple of the months I read 0 book, and a couple of the months I read, I think, 3 books, and then when I was reading, it goes up to 15 books. October, I think, is when I was rereading Saga, so that's why that one is the biggest. So speaking of rereads, I did 9 rereads. So some of those were the Saga graphic novels and some were the Twilight reread. Actually, I feel like I reread more than I don't know. That's what I've written down, so we'll go with it. Looking at the genres that I read is, again, Saga really skews this graph because it makes fantasy a lot higher than it should be, but as expected, general fiction is the biggest section because realistic, contemporary, any type of book like that is the one I pick up the most. Fantasy, sci-fi is the next biggest, but that's pretty much just because of Saga. If we were to ignore that, the next biggest is mystery thriller, which is interesting. And then non-fiction. Looking at age, again, no surprise, but the most amount of books came under the adult age range. My rating is actually quite interesting. I don't even know what my average rating is because I calculated it before I read some books at the end of the year, but I think it's like 4.2, which is what it's come out at previous years. And I used to think like, am I rating books too high? Like, am I being too easy on books? But I don't think it is. I'm just picking up books that I like. Plus some of those were rereads. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a high average rating. I just know my reading taste, and maybe I am an easy to please reader. I do think I give out a lot of 5 stars, but if I like a book, then I like a book, and I think that's fine. So the graph for my rating, as you can see, like 50% is 5 stars, which again, Saga contributed to that. Not all of them were 5 stars, but a few of them were. So, and then the next biggest section is actually 4 stars. So again, I do think I'm an easy to please reader. Next, let's look at some author stats. So a majority of the authors that I read from were female. Male was the least, and then the other category is obviously non-binary or multiple authors. A majority of the authors I read from were also new to me, with 63.6% being authors I've never read from before. And then here is that represented with pictures. And not enough Australian authors that I wanted to read this year, but that's fine. The authors I read from the most, obviously Saga with Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples came first because there were 10 with the 9 backlist ones and the new release. But after that I had 3 books from Emily Henry and 3 books from Stephanie Meyer, which would have been more if I finished off. I read, I think it's around 13 2022 releases. So I often just go for backlist titles. I think I'm not as good at picking up new releases, but that's fine. And then I think it's 15 books that I read for a book club or a buddy read, which is good considering that was also a goal of mine for the year, which by the way, I will do a goals video, I think. Now let's look at stats for the books that I bought, which I did buy a lot of books this year. Last year, I think it was almost 100. It was like in the 90s, which is a lot, but that's fine. When I look at where I got the books from, the biggest section is actually Book of the Month, which I'm not even really using. I kind of just let my subscription keep going. I was getting them, as you know, shipped over to Australia, but it's gotten too expensive. My original plan, I have grandparents in America, and my original plan was to get it shipped to their house. They weren't really leaving the house because of COVID, so then I got a shipping service, but it's gotten too expensive now, so I don't think I'm going to keep doing it. But ignoring that, the next biggest section is actually from indie/small businesses, which is great because again, that was my focus to buy books from. And then after that is gifts. And my smallest 2 sections are the ones that I want to try and buy from the least, is Big W and Kmart, and then Amazon, because I would like to support less of the big companies and more of the small companies. So I'm glad with how that looked. And then looking at the books that I read, 52% of them were the ones that I bought this year, and then 38% were ones that I had already owned. So it looks like I was buying books and reading them rather than picking from my shelves that I already have, but that's fine. And then 9% was from the library, but that's not counting audiobooks. Like if I was reading the audiobook and following along physically, that's just the library's physical books, which would be higher, but I did move and my library that's closest to me doesn't have as much of the books that I'm interested in, I've noticed. So I still had my old library, that section would probably be bigger, but it's fine. And I think that that is all of the stats that I'm going to talk about today. I don't know if this was interesting to anyone else, but this is more for me than anything, and I can look back on it next year and be able to compare the two. So yes, let me know what some of the stats that you had for your reading year, if it was similar to mine. Thank you so much for watching, and I think I will do a goals video next, so be on the lookout for that. I'm trying to like film a bunch in one go if I have a chance, so that's now. So yeah, I'll see you next time.